All right, so let's start with what do American investors need to know about, and when I say investors, I mean activist investors, need to know about running activist campaigns in Canada and overseas?
So why don't I start? You know, Canada is an interesting place from an activist perspective. It's obviously very familiar ground in a lot of ways. We have very similar legal and political systems. Obviously, language is in common, other than a few boots and A's maybe that you'd have to work your way through. And so, from interestingly, Canada does not have a lot of sort of domestic-based, purely activist funds. So we certainly have lots of institutional investors that will engage in activist activities where it's appropriate, but we really don't have an equivalent to a Starboard or an Elliott in Canada. And so particularly for kind of large cap names, when you see activist initiatives involving Canadian companies, it very frequently is a Starboard or an Elliott or another US-based activist who has noticed an opportunity in a Canadian company and wants to take advantage of it just the way they would with a domestic company.
Is there an institutional reason behind that?
It's just a small market, and there's not a ton of capital that gets allocated to activist-specific only strategies. So there's a lot of kind of long, short, or general funds that will engage in that type of behavior, and there's some smaller pockets of capital that are dedicated to that strategy, but there's just not enough money in big pools that are exclusively focused on that type of activity. It's sort of the nature of the market more than anything else.
Okay, Chris, let's talk a little bit about Europe. So talk a little bit about what kinds of companies you've worked with in Europe and what the intricacies of those campaigns were.
Yeah, look, I think a couple things about Europe. European activism's up almost 50% this year. And the way to think about European activism is 50% is in the UK. We can talk about that a bit. And then the next two largest markets are Germany and France. Germany making up about 15%, then France falls to about 7%. The UK is most like the US. So it's, in the US, almost half of all campaigns are for M&A. The UK, it's about 40%. And next would be moving personnel. The difference in the UK, though, is you don't see that much public activity in terms of pushing for board seats. It's much more behind doors. I think that's key. What's a message in the UK market, what we're dealing with a lot with our clients now is considering, well, depressed valuations and considering redomiciling or relisting in the New York Stock Exchange, for example. When I think about Germany and France, let's start with France. France still is highly regulated. Short selling activities targeted by the regulators. There have been changes. Now there's a say on pay in France. But it's still governance focused, right? And M&A only makes up about 15% of those claims. And then Germany falls in the middle, right? Germany is probably the next hotbed, that's how we view it. You're seeing activity with really large cap names, Bayer would be an example, with real name activists, right? I think that's kind of the frontier. And again, it's still more governance and personnel focused, but M&A is about a third of those campaigns.